For 40 years, an archive containing thousands of wartime accusations sat behind locked doors. Then researchers forced it open, and discovered the world had known far more about the killing than anyone admitted. By the end, you'll know what was inside, why governments restricted it, and how those forgotten pages shattered one of the most convenient stories told after the Second World War. Imagine entering a government building decades after the war. You pass polished corridors, locked offices, and clerks who barely look up. Somewhere inside is a collection of files assembled while the fighting was still happening. Not memoirs written years later. Not reconstructed testimony. Contemporary reports sent while villages were burning and prisoners were disappearing. The archive belonged to the United Nations War Crimes Commission, an organization created by Allied governments in 1943. Its purpose was brutally practical: collect accusations, identify suspected war criminals, and prepare cases for the moment occupied Europe was liberated. 17 Allied nations participated. Governments in exile submitted reports from resistance networks, diplomats, escaped prisoners, underground newspapers, and witnesses who had crossed borders alive. Names were recorded. Units were identified. Locations were mapped. Crimes were categorized. And then, after the war, the archive effectively vanished from public view. It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't misplaced during reconstruction. It remained under institutional control, protected by access rules so restrictive that even serious researchers struggled to see it. To understand how strange that is, picture the scale. The Commission processed tens of thousands of cases involving tens of thousands of accused individuals. Its files contained allegations of mass shootings, deportations, torture, forced labor, hostage executions, and systematic persecution. These were not vague rumors. Many submissions included dates, chains of command, witness statements, and lists of victims. Yet by the early 1950s, the Commission itself had been dissolved. Its documents were transferred into United Nations custody. Requests for access could be delayed, limited, or denied. The records were still there. But for most of the world, they might as well have been sealed inside a vault. Here is what makes these records different. After every catastrophe, memory begins to shift. Witnesses forget details. Officials protect themselves. Institutions rewrite timelines. Events that once seemed obvious become blurred by denial, politics, and distance. But these files were created before anyone knew exactly how the war would end. Reports crossed Europe through diplomatic pouches, coded transmissions, neutral capitals, and underground networks. Information arrived unevenly, sometimes incomplete, sometimes horrifyingly precise. A government in exile might receive testimony describing prisoners loaded onto trains and sent east. Another report might identify an officer accused of ordering civilians shot in retaliation for partisan activity. A third could document forced laborers being starved, beaten, or worked to death. Commission staff examined each allegation, requested additional material, and decided whether a case justified placing a suspect on an official list. That process was imperfect. Some claims were mistaken. Names were misspelled. Witnesses could repeat rumors. Wartime intelligence always carries uncertainty. But the larger pattern was impossible to miss. Long before liberation exposed the camps in their full horror, Allied institutions were receiving structured accounts of mass murder. Not merely chaos behind the front line. Policy. The documents show officials wrestling with questions that still feel disturbingly modern. Could a government murder its own citizens and call it an internal matter? Could persecution based on religion or ethnicity be prosecuted internationally? Did following orders excuse the person carrying them out? The Commission pushed toward an answer that had not yet been fully accepted: some crimes were so vast that sovereignty could not shield them. That idea would later help shape the concept of crimes against humanity. But at the time, it was politically explosive. And once the shooting stopped, the Allies developed priorities that made these records increasingly inconvenient. The popular version of post-war history is clean. The Allies defeated fascism. The camps were liberated. War criminals were hunted. Justice followed. The real sequence was messier. Major leaders were prosecuted at Nuremberg and in other international trials. Thousands of additional cases were heard in national and military courts. But the appetite for prosecutions began shrinking with remarkable speed. Trials were expensive. Witnesses were scattered. Evidence crossed jurisdictions. Governments wanted reconstruction, not endless legal proceedings. Then the Cold War hardened. Germany was no longer only the defeated enemy. Its western zones were becoming a strategic barrier against the Soviet Union. Administrators, scientists, intelligence officers, industrial experts, and military professionals suddenly had value. The question changed from, "What did this person do during the war?" to, "Can this person help us now?" Sentences were reduced. Convicted figures were released. Investigations slowed. Suspects emigrated, changed names, or returned to respectable careers. The Commission's files posed a problem because they preserved accusations from before those compromises became normal. A document does not care that a former enemy has become useful. A witness statement does not automatically disappear when alliances change. A list of suspects can remain dangerous long after governments decide to move on. Restrictions were justified partly through privacy, diplomatic sensitivity, and concern that unproven accusations could damage living people. That concern was not imaginary. An allegation is not the same thing as a conviction. But secrecy protected more than the falsely accused. It also protected governments from a much larger question. If they possessed these reports during the war, why did justice narrow so quickly afterward? For decades, the archive existed in a strange half-life. Officials knew it was there. A small number of authorized researchers knew it was there. Survivors and legal investigators sometimes knew fragments of what it contained. But public history developed without meaningful access to the complete record. This matters because locked archives do not create silence evenly. Governments retain institutional memory. Intelligence services keep their files. Officials can consult internal records or decide what to release. Ordinary people cannot. A survivor trying to establish what happened to a family member may have only a name and a final postcard. A prosecutor looking for a fugitive may not know that another government documented the same person decades earlier. A historian may conclude that evidence did not exist, when the evidence is simply inaccessible. By the 1980s, a new generation was asking harder questions about unfinished prosecutions and respectable post-war careers. Investigators were tracing suspects who had lived openly for years. Journalists were examining how governments recruited former enemy specialists. Historians were challenging the comforting belief that the full scale of the atrocities became apparent only when Allied soldiers entered the camps. Pressure grew around the restricted commission files. And then one international scandal dragged the buried past directly into the present. But before we get to that, you need to understand something even stranger. The archive did not merely preserve what happened. It preserved when the outside world learned about it. A post-war testimony can be dismissed as damaged memory. A photograph taken after liberation can be framed as a discovery made too late to influence wartime decisions. But a report stamped in 1943 cannot be pushed forward into 1945. Its date becomes evidence of knowledge. Inside the Commission's records were accusations concerning concentration camps, deportations, organized executions, and the targeting of civilian populations. Some cases addressed crimes against people persecuted by their own governments, forcing legal officials to confront the limits of traditional war crimes law. The implication was devastating. The Allies did not need to understand every mechanism of extermination to understand that systematic mass killing was underway. They possessed enough information to debate responsibility, collect names, and begin designing prosecutions before the war ended. That does not mean every leader knew every detail. It does not prove that one simple military action could have stopped the machinery. And it does not erase the extraordinary difficulty of verifying information during a global war. The truth is more uncomfortable than a simple accusation. Knowledge existed in layers. Resistance members knew one layer. Governments in exile knew another. Intelligence agencies, diplomats, military commands, and political leaders each possessed different pieces. The Commission became one place where those pieces accumulated. And when its archive became inaccessible, the paper trail of that accumulated knowledge became easier to forget. In 1986, the wartime past of Kurt Waldheim became an international scandal. Waldheim had served as Secretary General of the United Nations and was campaigning for the Austrian presidency. During the war, he had been an intelligence officer in a German army unit operating in the Balkans. Investigators began examining discrepancies in the public account of his military service. The controversy raised questions about what he had witnessed, what his unit had been connected to, and what international institutions already possessed in their archives. Waldheim denied participation in war crimes. No court convicted him of one. But the investigation exposed how difficult it was to examine wartime allegations when crucial international records remained restricted. Suddenly, the archive was not an abstract collection. It was connected to a man who had occupied one of the most visible diplomatic positions in the world. Researchers and campaigners intensified demands for access. In 1987, the United Nations eased the rules, allowing accredited scholars broader entry into the Commission's records. More than 40 years after the war, the sealed collection began resurfacing into public history. Researchers could finally examine how cases had been assembled and what officials had known while the conflict continued. The opening was still controlled. Access remained bureaucratic, and later campaigns would push for fuller public availability. But the wall had cracked. And behind it was not one explosive page naming a single hidden mastermind. What emerged was more disturbing. A system of early warnings, legal arguments, suspect lists, and detailed accusations that proved the record had been forming in real time. This is the central reveal. The files did not prove that every wartime rumor was true. They proved something harder to dismiss. The Allies were documenting systematic atrocities years before victory, and they were already imagining legal mechanisms to punish them. The world did not move from total ignorance to sudden enlightenment in the spring of 1945. It moved through warnings, partial confirmations, political hesitation, legal experimentation, and selective attention. The archive showed that governments in exile were not simply pleading for sympathy. They were building cases. It showed that victims and resistance networks were transmitting names and details outward, often at enormous personal risk. It showed that international lawyers were confronting crimes against civilians before the phrase, crimes against humanity, became permanently associated with Nuremberg. And it revealed how quickly post-war necessity could bury wartime determination. The most chilling part is not that the records were locked away. It is that the silence worked. Once the Commission disappeared and prosecutions declined, later generations could imagine that little had been known, little could have been done, and the pursuit of suspects had naturally reached its limit. The files complicated every part of that story. They revealed that justice was not abandoned because evidence had completely vanished. In many cases, evidence was waiting in boxes. Justice narrowed because political priorities changed, witnesses became harder to reach, institutions lost momentum, and former enemies became strategically useful. The vault's contents were not a map to one grand conspiracy. They were evidence of something more ordinary, and therefore more frightening. Governments can acknowledge a crime, document it carefully, promise accountability, and still decide that continuing is inconvenient. Not through a single command. Through delay. Classification. Restricted access. Reduced budgets. Shortened sentences. Files transferred from one office to another until responsibility belongs to no one. That is how history disappears while remaining perfectly preserved. For survivors, an archive is never only paper. One line can confirm that a missing relative reached a camp. A transport number can connect a name to a destination. A witness statement can prove that a crime dismissed for decades was reported almost immediately. But archives also expose a cruel imbalance. Institutions can wait. Victims cannot. Every year of restricted access means witnesses die, memories fade, suspects disappear, and families lose the chance to ask questions while someone capable of answering them is still alive. By the time many wartime collections became easier to study, the people named in them were elderly or dead. The documents survived the witnesses. That is why access matters. Not because every accusation should be treated as a verdict, but because evidence cannot be tested while it remains locked away. A democratic archive must protect the innocent. Without protecting history from scrutiny. The sealed collection changes the way you see wartime secrecy. The secret was not simply what happened. Millions already knew pieces of that through loss, flight, occupation, and terror. The deeper secret was the paper trail showing how those pieces reached the halls of power, and how easily that trail slipped out of public memory once the war was over. A locked archive does not erase history. It creates two versions of it. One version is available to institutions, protected by procedure and stored behind controlled doors. The other is what the public is permitted to remember. For 40 years, those versions drifted apart. Then the doors opened, the dates became visible, and the comforting timeline collapsed. The world had not learned everything at once. It had learned enough to start writing names down. And later chose not to keep all of those names in sight. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. And next time, a program ran for years with no budget and no record. The documents prove it existed. Because sometimes the most dangerous operation is the one designed to leave nothing behind, except a file someone forgot to destroy.